started. So welcome to what is now the 21st event of the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications and Technologies Practices Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm going to give the whole kind of rundown of the series because we're also recording this event for our YouTube channel to make these events more accessible. So I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor here at McGill at the Institute of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies and the organizer of this series. So the goal of this series is to bring together scholars, creators, people in industry, working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. This series brings forward critical approaches to publishing practices, communication strategies, and techniques for making research dissemination more accessible. And part of the motivation to make this series is that while humanities and social science scholars will critique traditional academic publishing and communication strategies as being sexist, classist, racially biased, and inaccessible, the kinds of solutions that are oftentimes proffered, such as open access, such as innovative new technologies in this kind of broad, vague sense, they oftentimes romanticize and fetishize technological alternatives and don't look at how inequity can be perpetuated or only shifted, especially at the level of algorithms. As we seek to draw attention to power relations that have long been invisibilized, it's important to recognize the land on which we are here commencing, to draw attention to Canada's long colonial history and that we are currently on unceded territory, as well as the fact that James McGill owned enslaved peoples, and that those histories are with us today. This series was made possible from a large variety of funders, including SSHRC, the IGSF, and actually every university in Montreal. So please check out our website to follow more of our events. So we'll have over 25 this year, and it's looking about hopefully up to 20 events next year as well. Our next event is on February 20th with Meredith Whitaker, the co-founder of the AI Now Institute. On February 26th, Yuan Stevens will be speaking on Montreal's role in the global AI industry. And then we'll have a pause until March 18th, which is when season 2 starts with Gabriella Coleman giving a presentation. And we have videos of a lot of our past events on our website, which you can find at disruptingdisruptions.com. It's the redirect URL. All of our events are free to attend and open to the public. So now for today's event. Corina MacDonald is a SSHRC-funded PhD candidate in communication studies at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Her doctoral research focuses on self-archiving infrastructures and platforms as a site of inquiry for understanding the impact of datafication on humanities scholarly communication. She is a founding member of the archive+design collective Montreal, which works with cultural organizations, researchers, and artists to develop web-based tools and publications. And I also want to add that Corina was part of one of the first events that kind of led to the creation of this series. So it's great to have her back today. So thanks, Corina.
And thank you for having me as part of this series, which is really amazing, and I highly recommend that you all check out some of the other events that are coming up, or the past ones as well, that I guess are on the YouTube channel. So today I'm going to talk about datafication and scholarly communication. So just to give you an overview of where this is going to be going, I'm going to start by talking about datafication as a process, and then talk a bit about research measurement and some specific sort of indicators and associated problems with research measurement in general. And this will provide some context for my research, which is more focused on informal practices of network circulation that are usually characterized as self-archiving. And then I'll talk about how self-archiving has been appropriated by platforms such as Academia.edu and ResearchGate, and discuss some aspects of their business models. And one of the questions that I'm trying to explore through all this is how the success of these platforms might be related to broad changes that we see happening in academic labor under contemporary capitalism. So, to begin, datafication, quite broadly, is a process through which previously unquantified elements are rendered as data. So this is not, by definition, a digital process, but I think that the ubiquity of digital technology in so many areas of contemporary life has created increasing opportunities and also demands for datafication. demands to quantify previously personal activities even, such as you might think about meditation, listening to music, health or physical exercise. So data and metrics have come to underpin much of the value generation of contemporary capitalism. And metaphors are abound basically to sort of frame the potential value of data, usually in very extractive and exploitative terms. We've all heard that data is the new oil, or other metaphors that frame it as a resource to be extracted, processed, and refined, or even sometimes as a natural resource, or a natural force, like a tsunami or some kind of deluge that can be channeled. So these metaphors position data in a continuum with historically cascading patterns of exploitation of cheap labor and resources, and some have likened these processes of datafication to forms of colonial exploitation. The use of resource metaphors for data obscures the ways in which it is produced, because it is not really just a raw material or a resource that can be picked up and used. As Bowker famously stated, raw data is an oxymoron and a bad idea. And I think what he's getting at here is the idea of data provenance, that losing track of the original context of creating a data set can have harmful effects later on as data is decontextualized, aggregated, and manipulated to different ends. Datafication is one of the sort of defining mechanisms or strategies of social media platforms and is central to their value logic, because as intermediaries, they are positioned not only to collect the data that is produced by users, but also to determine the form that the data will take. So they can privilege certain types of activities or indicators over others. And this rendering of cognitive or social processes into standardized data points makes them generative in specific ways as they're aggregated to produce value for the platform business model. So these are just none of these are from my pages, by the way. Examples of some familiar sort of data that we might see on a daily basis. Another aspect of datafication that I want to consider is labor, because this is often marginalized in these discussions, and I think this has become, because data has become so naturalized that it is taken for granted. And I think that we can sort of see this in two ways, as the labor of datafication as well as datafication of labor. So in the first case, we can think about how data is captured, processed, and by whom. And these are the kind of provenance questions that are often overlooked or not documented. And there is, in fact, an enormous amount of work often required to produce data in a meaningful way and make it ready for processing, often invisible labor that may be done by students, for example, or sometimes outsourced to platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk. And on the other hand, I think in terms of datafication of labor, we can think about the way that complex social relations are rendered as data, as sort of interactions are taskified into a series of clicks. This is a way in which intellectual labor, for example, could be transformed into content creation for a given platform. So we can think about datafication as this process of transformation and quantification, while keeping in mind that the decisions made about how to quantify different kinds of lived experience have implications for our social world, shaping what we can know and how we know it. So before I talk about Academia.edu and ResearchGate, I want to situate these platforms a bit within a larger context of datafication and scholarly publishing that dates back to the late 19th century, but really became institutionalized in the 20th century with a field of study known as bibliometrics. So bibliometrics is a form of statistical analysis for the study of publication and citation. So it can be used to identify trends in publication practices, and it can also be used to develop specific indicators to measure impact, which is broadly understood as importance and reach within a given discipline. So for example, citation counts are a basic example of a bibliometric indicator, and one that we would probably all tend to use as an indicator of importance. But there are a whole variety of indicators. Here on the slide, I've just included very few actually, but we have indicators usually at the author level, the article level, or the journal level. And I don't actually want to go into very much detail about these specifically, because the point that I want to make is that in many ways these indicators have become a kind of necessary shorthand for the functioning of academic labor as these externalized forms of validation. So for example, how would we assess the work of a scholar who's in a subject area that we're not familiar with? For example, we would probably tend to look at their publications, their citations, and where they have published. So this kind of reputational capital has been integral to the development of the scholarly publishing industry and to associated academic reward systems of funding, employment, and tenure. So many of these indicators are actually quite contentious, and their meaningfulness is debated. And there are some critiques of these indicators that come from within the field of bibliometrics itself, including critiques of conceptual weakness or inaccuracy or problems with integrity. So can the metrics be gamed? Can they really be used to accurately compare, for example, between scholars in different disciplines or between journals? They also exclude certain kinds of circulation. So for example, forms of non-scholarly circulation or citation, community collaboration or community uptake of work, or there may be certain kinds of work, for example, research creation, that are not circulated or cited in the same way as journal articles, and so are excluded. And there is this sort of new area of alt metrics, which attempts to account for other forms of circulation through social media, news media, Wikipedia, and other sources, but some of these indicators have been subject to the same criticisms of conceptual weakness and inaccuracy. And one of the biggest problems may be that many of these bibliometric indicators are actually created and owned by the same multinational publishing companies that make billions of dollars in profits off of research every year. So in the case of Elsevier, for example, they are both a publisher of journals and also a ranker of journals because they develop their own proprietary indicator called CiteScore. So this also leads to a lack of transparency because scholars cannot get access to these proprietary data sets. Sometimes they can, but not always. So they can't really reproduce the metrics. So just very quickly and in sort of broad strokes, I've tried to summarize a little bit research measurement, bibliometric indicators, some of the issues as well with these indicators for assessing research impact. The field of bibliometrics itself, the study of citation, can also tell us many interesting things actually about patterns of citation over time and in different disciplines. So in some cases there have been kind of troubling findings from bibliometric studies which identify and describe uneven power relations. So some examples. It was observed in 1934 that citation follows a power law, so this is the 80-20 rule, in which 80% of citations are received by 20% of papers. So this has been surprisingly consistent across disciplines and over time. We also have the Matthew effect, which was observed in citation in 1968 by Robert Merton. This is also known as cumulative advantage. And this effect basically states that recognition is more likely to be given to those who already have high degrees of recognition than those who are less well known. So, for example, researchers at prestigious institutions will receive more citations, articles in high reputation journals will receive more citations, and researchers who have more citations will tend to gain additional citations at a higher rate than others. So this is essentially the rich get richer phenomenon sort of within citation. In 1993, Margaret Rossiter, who was a historian, argued for the inverse effect to be equally noted. And she named this the Matilda effect after the suffragist and abolitionist Matilda Gage. This is the poor get poorer part of this sort of equation. So those with less capital tend to get poorer over time. And this effect was used to describe the systematic under-recognition of women's contributions to science. Today, bibliometric studies can still tell us things about, for example, citation gender gaps, which are still prevalent in certain disciplines, and this has been studied in certain fields like political science and international relations. So citation metrics and the pressures that they exert work to support established hierarchies of knowledge and knowledge producers. And these indicators are what David Beer would call productive measures. So indicators do not only measure, they exert a normative power to produce certain kinds of behaviors and practices as people adapt to improve their scores. So at some point we might ask the question of whether we are actually measuring impact or are we producing impact. These indicators are productive in that they reward certain choices, practices, and in some ways come to constrain even our understanding of what scholarship looks like. The demand for metrics in many areas of academic life, so not only publishing, but also now in teaching and administration, seems to be increasing, and sometimes seems as if this datafication is happening for its own sake. Bill Reddings, in his 1997 book, The University in Ruins, argues that this transactional, almost circular logic is central to the notion of excellence that's so commonly used in different aspects of the university today. So we can think about excellence in service provision, excellence in teaching, or in research. The notion of excellence is kind of an empty signifier that allows for equivalences to be made between very different, previously incomparable processes. It refers here, he says, to nothing other than the optimal input-output ratio in matters of information. So although datafication is happening in different sectors of the university, it is also uneven across departments, disciplines, and national contexts. So humanities departments may be less inclined to use metrics in decision-making about hiring or tenure. I'm not really sure because I'm not on those committees, but it's a feeling that I have. But they're also at the same time under pressure in other ways to quantify their worth to the university. So I've tried to describe a little bit some of the contemporary context of datafication within scholarly publishing. But what about the more sort of informal practices of network circulation, like self-archiving? These have not really been the target of such intense measurement or commercial interest until recently. So self-archiving is commonly understood as a practice of uploading a full-text version of a paper to a network that is then freely available to read and or download. And this practice was happening informally among computer science researchers in the 1980s. And with the beginning of the World Wide Web in 1989, the idea of sharing research directly between scholars using these technologies became much more widespread. In some ways, the egalitarian and utopian discourses of the early web were taken up by scholars who believed that this medium could revolutionize scholarly communication. So they thought it would make it faster, more direct, overcome temporal as well as material limitations of the publishing process, and focus on the circulation of preprints to avoid copyright restrictions. In 1990, Stephen Harnad, who became a major figure in the open access movement, and I believe is still currently at University of Montreal, referred to this as scholarly skywriting, and he proposed that researchers use FTP archives to post and share their work. And in 1991, we see the first sort of self-archiving repository being launched, archive.org, which is for preprints in mathematics and physics. This repository is still online today, and it's hosted by Cornell University since 2011. In 1994, the SSRN, the Social Sciences Research Network, went online. This one was later purchased by Elsevier, actually, in 2016. Self-archiving is promoted as a vehicle of open access, and the circulation of preprints came to be known as green open access. And today the practice has become a bit more formalized through the development of institutional repositories, which are university-based, and this is my university's repository, Spectrum. Or there are also thematic repositories. This is a recent repository in my field, Media, Film, and Communication Studies, Media Archive. So since the early 90s, self-archiving has remained mostly on the periphery of the value regimes of academia. It's kind of been this alternative or complementary activity for the most part. And it's only fairly recently that there's any specific career requirements for self-archiving. So in 2015, Canada's tri-agency funding bodies started requiring open access, requiring that research results were made open access. And so self-archiving becomes like a big part of that mandate. It hasn't been as widely adopted in the humanities generally, I think in part because the humanities disciplines don't really have the same temporal concerns. They work more within the rhythm of monograph publishing and have slower citation rates. So speed and efficiency are not usually benchmarks for humanities scholarly communication. So it had a lower uptake, I would say, in general within the humanities until recently, with the emergence of these new academic social network platforms that have taken self-archiving and made it rewarding in new ways. I had to try. So let's talk about these platforms. So Academia.edu, their mission is to accelerate the world's research. Many people wonder why they still have this .edu domain name. It was registered before restrictions went into place, and they were allowed to keep it afterwards. And their last funding round was about a year ago. And most of that funding, 16 million, came from Tencent, which is the Chinese multinational conglomerate that owns WeChat, as well as several other sort of Chinese internet companies and platforms. Their user base, last time I checked, over 112 million users, but it seems to go up fairly quickly, so maybe there are even more at this point. ResearchGate, the mission is to connect to the world of science, make research open to all. Their last funding round was in 2017 and includes a real motley crew of characters that you wouldn't expect to see together. In this list, I think, Bill Gates, Ashton Kutcher, Goldman Sachs, the Wellcome Trust, LVMH, which is a luxury good conglomerate, which I think owns Dior. So interesting combination of people. Over 15 million members so far, they claim, and at one point in 2017, they said that they were receiving 2.5 million publications per month on the platform. I'll just talk briefly about some of the features of these. Both of them are free to join, although Academia.edu also has a premium membership. And ResearchGate is a little bit more restricted in membership because you have to have an institutional email address or some other kind of affiliation in order to sign up. This is the profile of the CEO, by the way, Richard Price. The platform interfaces are only in English, although you can upload papers in other languages. And they have features that are quite similar to other kinds of social media sites. So you create a profile page with your information, your research interests. You'll have a homepage feed where you see content based on your interests or based on other interactions within the site. You can upload your papers, you can search for papers, and you have access to an analytics dashboard that gives you stats based basically on your activity within the platform. And this is sort of the key offering, I think, of these two platforms in a way. So what I'm interested in doing is examining the business models of these platforms, particularly in continuity with practices like self-archiving and infrastructures like the repository. Because I think there's an interesting parallel between the discourses of the early 90s when the web was imagined as a potential solution to problems with the publishing industry and the discourses that are leveraged today by these startups. So you'll see actually that they frame what they're doing often in the very same terms. They talk about accelerating research, making research open, and citation advantage. And maybe this is partly because the conditions of publishing haven't greatly changed over 30 years. If anything, these publishing companies may have actually consolidated their power over that time. So these new platforms see themselves as disruptors to this industry. And I was going to show a very short clip of an interview with Ijad Matic, who's the CEO of ResearchGate, which I think is quite revealing.
Maybe you could put around maybe This was quite loud before.
Yeah. We did test this earlier.
We tested it, yeah.
But yeah.
And the thing got on the side.
Go back to this one.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Can you check that? Can you play it as an individual YouTube clip? Like if you put it on the YouTube and play it externally maybe over?
It's not accuracy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically scientific journal field works is a bit of a racket, right? So as I understand it, you, as a scientist, you submit your article to a Nature or Science, and then they ask people in your field to review the publication. And then you have to pay, is that right? As a scientist, you have to pay to get your article published in Nature or Science.
Yes.
So how would that differ? How does it differ if you want to get people to publish on ResearchGate?
Yes. So that several differences. You pointed them out correctly. One is you have to pay to get published in these magazines, which then sell these subscriptions back to the library, which again have to buy these these subscriptions to read the articles. And also, the results are not instantly available to other scientists in the world. Just imagine a world where we would remove, the friction and the inefficiencies we have right now in this scientific process.
And the results aren't available right away because of the lag between the time someone submits the article.
Reviews the article, and then there are sometimes, from my experience, I know that there are political decisions. So usually, the reviewers are reviewers who know your field. Mm-hmm. In many cases, of course, people who may be your competitors, and sometimes they delay the reviews because they have to publish their results. So there are many things which influences the current structure and which influences in a bad way, not in a good way. Yeah. And ResearchGate would exactly solve this by publishing the results instantly, and you can say to everyone, I was the first. You see that it's online, and I published these results first. And the publication nowadays in the old system takes from 6 months to even 3 years to get published. And in this time, people doing experiments and which they wouldn't do if they would know the results from these papers.
Right, so the speed is of the essence.
Yes.
Getting the results up online first would help a lot of scientists.
Absolutely, and that's another big thing, is sharing negative data and sharing raw data. Just imagine you're sitting in your laboratory making an experiment, and it's failing. Failed experiments, raw data, they're uploading these data sets into their profile, make them available for other scientists. And yeah, this is...
And there's no concern, there's no hindrance, and people aren't worried about them looking foolish by publishing a failed experiment.
No, I think the current system educated the scientists in a way which I want to change. I want that people don't think about a failure as a failure.
Mm-hmm.
Every failure is also a result, and this is how science should, look at it. And this is what we want to change.
And you have found support in Silicon Valley. You've raised money. You haven't disclosed how much, but you've raised 2 different rounds of funding from some of the most prestigious venture capital firms in the Valley. You want to talk about who those people are?
Yeah. So we raised money. The Series A was led by Benchmark, joined by Excel partners, Matt Kohler from Benchmark, an early employee at Facebook. And then the last round was done by Founders Fund, Luke Nosek. And yeah, these are the best people you can get to build this kind of startup.
What is it that your biggest goals? What do you really hope to accomplish with ResearchGate?
We want to change how scientists sharing data, which data they're sharing, in which way they are sharing it, and make them available for all these people in the world, and accelerating scientific breakthroughs by the fact that they're sharing these data sets. And I think that if that is going to happen, I think ResearchGate can win the Nobel Prize for this.
The Nobel Prize for Science.
For a category which we have to define.
Okay.
Okay, so there might be some things in what he says that we agree with, because there are obviously issues with publishing at the moment. So, but I think, when we go to this sort of Silicon Valley technological solutionism, I'm not sure if that's really the best response to these issues. I wanted to talk a little bit about how these sites actually make money. And this, of course, I just had to deduce from reading interviews with the founders and from what information can be found on their own sites. So they both seem to use your personal data for advertising. And on Academia.edu, they refer to this as interest-based or online behavioral advertising. ResearchGate calls it tailored advertising. You might think that they don't have a lot of your personal data on this site, but if you had signed up with Facebook, LinkedIn, or Google, then you've essentially given them access to your profile and all of your contacts there. So they might have more than you know. And in addition, so Academia.edu charges premium membership fees. So at the moment, this is $129 Canadian for the year. And this gives you access to more detailed, individualized metrics. It also gives you access to advanced search features on the site. Academia.edu has also had this idea of monetizing the content through the development of this trending papers algorithm. So this would determine what are the most impactful papers in a given research area and time period. And they would then sell this information to R&D companies. And ResearchGate has invested more in developing recruitment services, so they have people can pay basically to search for candidates or to advertise job postings in the platform. And these job postings come from universities as well as corporations. And you can also pay to have access to their recruitment research. So to make these business models profitable, you really need a critical mass and continued growth of both users and papers. And we can think of these as being network effects businesses. So the bigger the network, the more valuable it becomes for users as well as the owners. And there's no denying that the network size is also important for its normative power to sort of draw users in and keep them there. The importance of network effects leads these platforms to engage in some specific strategies to add users, or motivate them to be more active on the site. And these are sometimes annoying and sometimes even quasi-legal strategies, I would say. So if any of you have ever signed up to Academia.edu, I'm sure you've seen these because they will send you constant email prompts. It's almost like this sort of gamification of your reputation. They really want you to upgrade your account so that you can find out who has mentioned you, where you've been ranked, or all these different kinds of information. ResearchGate has been criticized for generating sort of automated profiles for people that actually never signed up to the site. And they've also done a lot of harvesting and posting articles as well without author permission. So they have been sent DMCA takedown notices from scholars. I think both of these sites also benefit from a lack of clarity over legal conditions for self-archiving. So authors are uploading papers when they don't have permission to do so based on their contracts with publishers. So, for example, Elsevier sent takedown notices to Academia.edu in 2013, and then the same thing happened in 2017 with ResearchGate, where a group of large publishers, including Elsevier, sent takedown notices as well. So I think maybe this is part of the move fast and break things ethic of these companies, and I think it also underscores their need to have more content in the site at any cost, perhaps. So more recently, it seems that ResearchGate has taken a different direction to actually collaborate with publishers. So they had a pilot project with Springer last year, where they provided full-text articles from Nature-branded journals within ResearchGate. Network effects depend also, of course, on people being active and interacting with other users. And the interaction mechanisms within these platforms are designed in very specific ways to promise new forms of individual branding and visibility, and to be quantified in certain ways that will shape scholarly behavior. And the founders are not shy about their goals of changing the behavior of scholars, as we saw in the video. I think in a broad sense, their goal is to shift power away from journals and publishers and toward the individual. So they're embracing this more neoliberal competitive logic that's centered on the role of self-branding and self-entrepreneurship. This is what Richard Price has to say about this. So the use of metrics, I think, is really key to their service offering to scholars and also key to changing their behaviors. And both of these platforms have developed their own proprietary in-platform algorithmic indicators. So there are basic information that you can find out in your profile, like how many followers you have, how many downloads, profile views, some web traffic stats. But they also develop these algorithmic indicators. So Academia.edu has author rank and paper rank. And these are actually quite transparent in terms of how they're calculated, so they're not really problematic in that way, as opposed to the ResearchGate score, the RG score, which is a composite score based on different aspects of your activity in the platform, but the formula is actually unknown, so it's not transparent or reproducible. It's really a black box kind of algorithm that changes without users' knowledge. So both of these, well, all of these metrics are really only focused on your activity in the platform. So they don't care how many citations you have in Google Scholar or anything else. It's really just what's happening within the platform. And of course, these metrics are also subject to many criticisms, just as other bibliometric indicators are also criticized. It's not really clear if these kinds of metrics are being used in evaluation, but scholars are starting to include these analytics in their grant applications and their CVs to sort of give them an edge. So the success of these platforms, I think, is illustrative of changing academic labor conditions and new pressures that are exerted on scholars to be visible, entrepreneurial, connected, and competitive. And these conditions provide a fertile ground for new forms of datafication of academic labor in which scholarly communication can become a source of data and therefore economic value for commercial entities. And this promise of visibility, of course, is not universal. We've already discussed some of the asymmetries of citation and the way that the rich get richer. But I think that these platforms stand to benefit in new ways from these asymmetries and the anxieties that they might produce. I think the success of these platforms is also related to, in general, a lack of sustainable public investment in infrastructure for scholarly communication. And as a result, there's been a growing dependence on infrastructure from the tech industry, so from Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple. In some ways, however, I think these two platforms, maybe they are actually more fine-tuned to the needs of scholars than, for example, the repository. The personalization that they offer can be valuable, especially as people are constantly asked to do more with less. So the idea of building an online network around my research interests and having papers recommended based on that seems like a great idea, but I think in these cases comes at a great cost. But I'm going to wrap up actually on a more sort of positive note by showing you some recent scholar-led initiatives in scholarly communication, which are sort of taking on some of this. So for example, we have Humanities Commons, which has kind of similar features to the platforms. It combines the repository functionality with the social network. And this site is run by the MLA, Modern Languages Association. There are a couple of sort of small collectives of presses and journals, I think, that are also interesting to follow to see what kinds of things they're working on. So the Radical Open Access Collective is exploring the radical potential of open access and trying to take back sort of the means of production to rethink scholarly publishing. And we also have the ScholarLED Collective, which is a consortium of nonprofit open access publishers. So they're working on infrastructure for scholar-led presses. So in general, just to wrap up, I think as we see this increasing attention to metrics in academic life, we have to inquire into the normative powers of these metrics and what is at stake when we make ourselves visible in particular ways. And that is all. Thank you.